Okay, it's about 9 o'clock, so I'm going to get started here. So probably as you saw on the website, today I'm presenting Accessing Accessibility. I'm Jennifer Wong. I'm a software engineer at Eventbrite, and this is my official Eventbrite photo with my cat, Fry. You can find me on GitHub at Genzor or on Twitter at MyBlueWristband. So I'm here with my brother today, and because it's our first time in Australia, I think you're supposed to hang out with baby kangaroos, right? So before I really get started, I just wanted to do a quick privilege check. So I'm speaking about accessibility today, and because I have a certain amount of privilege, I can't fully comprehend what it's like to live with a disability. So I just wanted to point out that I'm cisgender, I'm straight or heterosexual, I am from a middle to upper middle class family. I have no physical, social, or learning disabilities. I'm college educated, and I have a socially acceptable body type. So before we get started, it's really good to check your privilege and understand where you're coming from when you're working on accessibility. My interest in accessibility actually started by going to a conference called jQuery SF in 2015. And that was partially emceed by a man named Jennison Asuncion. And he's actually an accessibility advocate. And he organizes the Bay Area Accessibility and Inclusivity Design Meetup Group in San Francisco. And he also organizes GAAD, which is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. And that falls on May 18th every year. So there I actually saw Karen speak, and she talked about what it's like to navigate the web as a partially sighted person. And John Cooperman talked about going from a developer to becoming an ally. So he's coming at accessibility from the developer and coding perspective. And then I also saw Victor Saran speak about the Aria spec. And so he went in great detail into what Aria is. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So going to that conference, and they had a whole section of talks just about accessibility and its importance. And I was like, I need to know more about this. Tell me more. So what is accessibility? As Jennifer Marsman said, one source of truth, Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says web accessibility refers to the inclusive practice of removing barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites by people with disabilities. When sites are correctly designed, developed, and edited, all users have equal access to information and functionality. So here are a few people who have accessibility needs. So here we see Beverly Reddick, and she's actually helping customers. And you can see she's got a guide dog here, and she's navigating the web with her keyboard. We also see a senior who he has no specific disability. He's just older, and you can see that his keyboard is actually a high contrast, very large type keyboard. And then lastly, we'll see an IBM fellow, Chieko Asakawa, and she is actually blind, and she's testing this navigation app called NavCog, which helps navigate people through different spaces. So who else needs accessibility? Everyone. And who is everybody? So everybody could be anybody with any type of disability. So you could have a visual disability, and that may be blindness, low vision, poor eyesight, or color blindness. It could be a motor or mobility disability, and that would be difficulty or inability to use your hands, maybe caused by tremors or muscle slowness. You would have loss of fine muscle control, and those things could be caused by anything from Parkinson's disease to muscular dystrophy and cerebral palsy, that's a really hard word to say, and stroke. You could also have auditory disabilities, so that could be anything from deafness to hearing impairments or being hard of hearing. You could also have seizures, and that may be due to photoepileptic seizures that are caused by flashing effects. And then lastly, there are also cognitive or intellectual disabilities, and those range from developmental disabilities to learning disabilities such as dyslexia, and then cognitive disabilities affecting your memory, attention, or developmental maturity, problem solving, and logic skills. So the point of having the slide up here is just to point out that there's a range of disability. So saying that somebody has a visual disability doesn't automatically mean that they're blind. They just may have like blurriness in their eyes, things like that. And it could be caused by a range of things. So some statistics here. There's like a myth that people with disabilities are a minority user, but that's actually not true. And we can see by this chart put together by Google. The yellow bars are actually just people in the US using the internet with accessible needs. And so you can see that people in the US with that are maybe blind or have low vision that are using the internet actually totals more than the entire population of Canada, Italy, or Mexico. And then those who are deaf or hard of hearing that are using the internet just in the United States totals more than all those countries, as well as the entire population of Spain. So people with disabilities are not a minority user. We can also see that in the statistics that I have here. So about so I'm from the US, and that's why I have the US stats up there. So 18.7% of the US population have some type of disability, and 12.6% have a severe disability. And then about 18.5%, so it's about on par with the US, of the Australian population has a disability as well. So based on those numbers and numbers pulled from the World Health Organization of people living with disabilities in the entire world, we can estimate that about 7.5% of internet traffic comes from people with accessible needs. And that's a lot of people. So some quick stats about Eventbrite. So we actually noticed that about 25% of our traffic comes from people who are over the age of 45. And we also noticed that our bounce rate is higher among that population. So that's also something to consider. When you get older, like I started wearing glasses recently, whereas I didn't have to before. You may begin to feel like arthritis, osteoporosis, carpal tunnel, things like that, and it makes it much harder to navigate the web as you get older. So even if you're not living with a disability, everyone becomes older, and that means that the web's going to be harder to surf. So why should you do accessibility? Well, you're all here, so you already want to be allies, so let's do it together. One note about the A11Y. So I, for a long time, read that as ally, but it's actually because there are 11 letters between the A and Y in accessibility. So I like to say ally, ally sometimes. So why else should you do accessibility? Well, it's the law in a lot of places. So here in Australia, you guys have the Disability Discrimination Act, or the DDA, of 1992. And it basically states how you have to make things accessible in general, overall, for people in Australia. So Section 24 specifically states that it is unlawful for a person who provides goods, facilities, or services to discriminate on the grounds of disability. In addition to that, there were actually some advisory notes tacked on in 2002, and while this is not specifically a law, it's advisory notes in how to make the web accessible. So that was added on as well. Other reasons why you want to do accessibility: you might get sued. So here we see Bruce McGuire, and he actually sued the Sydney Organizing Committee for the Olympic Games, or SOCOG. He basically filed a complaint with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission under the DDA, which I just explained. And he essentially said that he was not able to navigate the Olympic Games websites. So he won that lawsuit, and SOCOG was required to make changes to their website to make them accessible. And they didn't, so then they got fined 20,000 Australian dollars for that. So during this time, Bruce McGuire said in an interview, "It's an ongoing campaign to raise awareness about web accessibility and keep asserting the fact that people with a disability have as much right to choice and inclusion as the rest of the community." Other places where there are accessibility laws: not just Australia, but also in Brazil, the European Union, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So if you're looking to internationalize, your website or your business, it's definitely good to take a look and see where all of these laws overlap and which ones are the most stringent. Some other lawsuits. So the Federation for the Blind in the US actually sued Target in a class action lawsuit. Target paid out about $6 million, and that's on top of the $4 million they paid in legal fees during this lawsuit. Most recently, Juan Carlos Gil actually sued the Winn-Dixie stores, which is a grocery chain in the US, and he won that lawsuit, so Winn-Dixie only had about 30 days to comply with WCAG 2.0 AA, which I'll explain in a little bit, but something to consider. So right now you have quite a bit of time to make your website accessible, but if you get sued, you're only going to have about 30 days. Other reasons to do accessibility. So it's really great for SEO. If you make your website accessible, it automatically becomes better for SEO. As well as becoming better and more navigable by everyone. So, for example, Googlebot is the world's most prolific blind user of the internet. So how should we do accessibility? The first thing you'll want to take a look at are some standards. So as I mentioned earlier, WCAG stands for, it actually stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guides, and those are put together by WAI, which is the Web Accessibility Initiative, of W3C, which is the World Wide Web Consortium. They really like their acronyms. So if you don't know, W3C is an international community that creates web standards, and so they've created a bunch of web standards on accessibility as well. Section 508 is part of US law, and it specifies that things must have, federal government agencies need to have accessible information, and that's specified in Section 508 specifically. So it's federal agencies as well as any group that takes federal funding in the US. And then essentially the equivalent in Australia is the DDA, which I had mentioned earlier. Interestingly, because Section 508 and the DDA are not super specific on web accessibility, they're just like, we're just going to try to comply with WCAG 2.0 AA. So that's kind of the gold standard these days. However, there are criticisms about WCAG 2.0. So first, the first criticism is that it doesn't sufficiently put the user at the heart of the process. So essentially, like as a user is going through user flows, that doesn't get addressed in WCAG. There's nothing to specifically address accessibility for those who have learning or cognitive disabilities. And it also doesn't keep up with current technology. So WCAG 2.0 came out in 2008, so it's been about 10 years and it hasn't been updated since then. And the guidelines are really hard to navigate. Just to give an example, I'm going to click on this guy so you guys can see just how crazy it is. Don't mind my banana. So this is WCAG, and you can see 2008 here. And it's just like a wall of text. And there are a ton of links, but there are just so many links, and it's crazy. So if I wanted to, for example, find out what are the regulations for color contrast? And I'm like, oh God, I have no idea where that is. They're somewhere down here. So you could just keep scrolling and scrolling for days and like not be able to find what you're looking for. So yes, that is definitely one of the criticisms. All right, back to slides. Okay, so now that we've gone through standards, let's talk about how we might want to test accessibility. So one of the first ways you'd want to test is just by tabbing through a website. So you just use your tab key and see what gets focused as you tab through a website. So that gives you an idea of like the tab index of elements on your page. You can also try navigating your website using some standard keyboard shortcuts, which I linked to here. Other ways to test is by using screen readers. So some screen readers, this is a sampling of some screen readers that are out there. Let's see, I've got some notes here. JAWS, Window Eyes, and NVDA are only for Windows. NVDA is actually free, and Window Eyes has an interesting deal where I think if you have Microsoft Office, it's also free. VoiceOver is used on Mac or OS X and iOS, and TalkBack is used on Android. So just really quickly, I wanted to talk about the popularity of screen readers. So these numbers, or this chart, comes from WebAIM, which is a group I'll talk about in a bit. But they put together a survey about every year. This one, I think, is from 2015 or 2016. And they asked people a bunch of questions about their accessible needs. So they basically asked, what is your primary screen reader? And here, the most popular one is JAWS, but I actually noticed there's a trending line going downwards, and more people are starting to use Zoom Text and Window Eyes, as well as NVDA. So here are the numbers, just really quickly. So again, we see JAWS is most popular, followed by Zoom Text, Window Eyes, NVDA, and then VoiceOver. And VoiceOver is just becoming more popular because people have iPhones, and that's what's used on iPhones as well as OS X. Other ways to test. You could test by using different assistive technology. So here we see a Braille reader up top, and then a high contrast keyboard below. And then here we see some people using some of this assistive technology. So we have Billy Harrison here, and he actually monitors the Air Force Information Network's global information grid. And you can see he's got assistive technology on his hands to help him type on the keyboard. Up in the top right, you can see David Riley, and he's actually a legally blind employee at a store. So all of these photos are generally from a US Air Force base because they're the ones that I can use non-commercially. And then also because they have to actually comply with Section 508 because they're a federal agency. So you can see here he's legally blind, and he's just leaning into his keyboard, and he actually works in customer support. And then lastly, you'll see an employee named Bernard Werwe, and he's using Zoom Text here to test websites. A bunch of other accessible devices. So you can see some special keyboards. You can see a Braille reader somewhere in there. There are also single switch buttons up there, and just different configurations that make things easier to use for people that maybe have like loss of fine motor control. Also, we see here a mouth stick or a head wand for people who don't have the use of their hands or their arms. And then lastly, we'll see here a chin controller. So this is Raymond Jenks, and he's an instructional systems specialist. So you can see here he's using a computer input device and a chin controller to do his work, and then also to drink water and take phone calls. So he's doing quite a bit over here. So you can also use eye tracking devices if you want to put together a really crazy accessibility lab. And then also there's single switch on-screen keyboards. So you see here, essentially it's a button that allows you to surf through websites and through your computer's operating system. And here's another example of one of those keyboards. All right, so those are ways of testing with assistive devices. Other ways you'll want to start getting tested is using web validators. So here are 3 that come highly recommended that we use all the time at Eventbrite. There's Wave, which is created by WebAIM, and then there's Axe, created by DEC University. And those are both available as Chrome extensions or Firefox extensions as well. Totally is created by Khan Academy, and you can actually just drop a script into, for example, your dev or maybe your QA environment, and that'll allow you to test your website as you're creating it. Another thing you'll want to validate is color contrast. So there are a few here. There are actually a ton online for verifying that you have good color contrast. I really like accessible colors because if a color doesn't work, they'll recommend a slightly different shade of it to make sure that it's compliant with WCAG. Another really interesting Chrome extension, which my friend told me about, is called NoCoffee. And it actually will simulate visual disabilities. So here I've upped the blur, and I've also, let's see, what else did I add? I added cloudiness, and that mimics cataracts, and some snow. So this is the Eventbrite homepage, and you can see like how somebody else with a visual disability might view your website. So it's a pretty neat extension. Some other ideas, you can try removing the CSS from your website and see if you can navigate it. You can bring people in and do in-person user testing to see how you're doing on your website. You can try blindfolding yourself. You can try blacked out glasses. And then you can also turn down your screen brightness and try to navigate using a screen reader or your keyboard. You can also use, just like NoCoffee, a color blindness or a low vision simulator. So here's actually a photo of some guys at Dropbox, the accessibility lab that they have there, and they're just testing their website using these weird goggles. All right, how else can we do accessibility? So we can do that by making sure our code's accessible. So the first thing that you'll want to do is make sure you have semantic HTML. So don't use a div as a span, don't use a span as an anchor tag, and don't use an anchor tag as a button. Or as Bee and Puppycat say, use the sword as a sword. So other things you'll want to make sure you have in semantic HTML is having a clear heading structure. So that means making sure that you have a correct flow of everything from your H1s to your H6s. Also, you'll want to be using semantic HTML tags such as nav or footer. There's all types. There's article, aside, main, section, header. Don't go too overboard. Use them where they're appropriate. With images, you'll also want to make sure that you have an alt attribute and make sure that within that alt attribute there's something descriptive and easily understandable. If the image is actually just decorative and has no other function, make sure that you have an alt attribute with nothing in it. And that'll essentially tell screen readers, oh, you can just skip over this image. If you have something more complex, such as a chart or a map, you'll want to make sure you have a full text description of what that is. Also, forms, make sure that your inputs have labels. So make sure that your label has a for attribute, and make sure that your input has a name attribute so that they're correctly associated together. And then make sure that in general across your website that your forms have consistent labels and buttons. For example, if you were to go into a website and one button said login and then one button said sign in, that could get really confusing, especially if you're coming at a website from a screen reader and you're like, do those buttons do different things? I'm not really sure. So make sure you have consistency across those labels and buttons. Also, with buttons and links, you'll want to make sure that you have a non-color indicator. I know designers really like to remove that underline from your links, but it's super helpful for making your website accessible. Also, having a clear hover and focus state is important for those buttons and those links as well. Tab ordering. So avoid this if you can. It essentially tells your keyboard or your browser like how you want to tab through your website. If you can't avoid it, then what you'll want to do is only use tab index of 0 or tab index of -1. So tab index of 0 essentially is like telling the browser like, hey, I want to put this thing into the tab index or tab ordering. And then -1 will just remove it from the tab ordering. So try not to go into 1 or higher when you're setting a tab index, because once you do that, you're actually telling the browser exactly how to navigate through. So there are pieces of your website that may get skipped if you do something like that. Videos and animations. So you'll want to make sure that your videos have closed captions, and make sure you turn off autoplay. That's like not helpful for accessibility or, for example, people who suffer from seizures. Also, you want to make sure you have a way to pause, play, and stop. Pause, start, and stop your animation or your video. And then also, it's really great to include a transcript of the video. So that could be on the page, or it could be a link to a transcript elsewhere. How else should you do accessibility? Aria, not this Aria, a different Aria. So Aria, as I may have mentioned earlier, well, WAI stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative. And then Aria stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. As I said earlier, W3C really likes their acronyms. So essentially, Aria was created because out of the box, screen readers worked with regular HTML. But if you needed to add more information for screen readers to understand what's happening on your website, Aria tags were created. However, just like with Aria from Game of Thrones, you'll want to be careful with Aria and Aria tags. And the reason for this is you'll want to just make sure that you have semantic HTML first. So Aria was created actually before all the semantic tags that we got. So before nav and before footer, before main. So it's kind of supplementary to your semantic HTML. So if you start to use Aria too much, it could be overkill. Get it? Haha. So the structure of Aria is there are roles, states, and properties. Roles are essentially a main indicator of type, and it allows tools to view elements as other elements of that type are viewed. That's a little bit confusing, but essentially, if for some reason you're unable to use a form tag, then you can actually add a role form onto your element, and you'll expect, or screen readers and people navigating your site will expect that that object functions as the way a form element would as well. So there are a ton of types of roles, and you can ignore the abstract role because these three, landmark, document, and widget, inherit from the abstract role. So just pretend that abstract's not there and is abstract. Let's see, a landmark role essentially identifies a large area to be used by a screen reader. So for example, the role banner, and that would be a large area of a banner. A document role essentially provides structural description for a section and are typically non-interactive. So some document roles it's like the form where they're actually mapped to elements that already exist. And then widget roles describe commonly used interactive patterns that don't have semantic HTML already. So for example, role tooltip. Aria States are a little bit self-explanatory, I think. They essentially describe the state of an element. So you have disabled, you have busy, grabbed, hidden, and invalid. And then Aria Properties will describe properties of an element. So here you have a long list of properties. One thing I wanted to note, label and labeled by always confuse me. So labeled by is the Aria tag you'll want to use if your label is actually visually available on the page. And then label is if that label is not visually available on that page. Other cool Aria things you can do is you can add skip links via Aria. So there are several ways you can do that, but it allows you to essentially skip the main navigation of a web page. So if you imagine you're tabbing through a website and you go to the next page and you have to go through every single piece of a navigation, it can get really tedious and annoying. So having a skip link is super helpful. The ways that you can do that is you could have a visible link at the top of the page, which is, of course, the best way to have a skip link. You could also have a visible link that's elsewhere on the page, which is less helpful because it's not actually associated with the navigation then. You can have an invisible link, which is really not super helpful unless you're tabbing through or using a screen reader. It's nice to know that you have that available to you first. Or you can use an invisible link that becomes visible as you're tabbing through or with keyboard focus. So that's actually what we use on Eventbrite. So you can see here in the top left, we have the skip main navigation. And you also want to be careful about your wording with that. So skip main navigation, I think, is pretty clear. And once you click on that, you'll be shot down to the search bar here. So you can skip browse events, you can skip learn more, you don't have to log in, and all of that. So how else should you do accessibility? You'll definitely want to make sure that you prevent regressions, so making sure your website stays accessible. So the ways you can do that is you can add unit tests, you can add automation tests, which will go through and ensure, for example, that your links have alt attributes. And then the other way we do things at Eventbrite actually is we have modular reusable components. So components on their own can be made to be accessible, and then it's up to each team when they're using those components to make sure that they're still accessible in the flow that they're creating. But having those modular reusable components be accessible already is definitely a step in the right direction. Okay, demo time. So everybody, I assume, has some form of mobile device and or computer. If everybody wants to pull those out, that would be awesome. So we're essentially going to use Narrator if you have a Microsoft device, TalkBack if you have an Android device, or VoiceOver if you have an iOS or OS X device. This is a link to my speaker deck, which is not super helpful because actually this speaker deck is not accessible because it's a PDF, so you wouldn't be able to tab through on that or actually fully read the text. But let's start off with Narrator. So if you have a Microsoft device right now, you can go to bit.ly/AAA Windows. I don't know, can anybody, or can you all raise your hand if you have a Windows device right now that you might be using? Oh, I thought this was a .NET conference. Okay, we'll skip Narrator then. And ease of use, which is actually used on the Windows phone. Okay, how many people have an Android device? Okay, we'll start with TalkBack then. So you can turn on TalkBack by going to Settings. And then you should be able to find TalkBack somewhere in there. There's also a link here, bit.ly/AAA Android. And that'll give you information on how to do that. Once you've turned on TalkBack, what you'll need to know is that you touch to explore, so it'll read out to you pieces of your operating system on your phone. And then you'll double tap in order to click on something. And there we go. Everybody turn up the volume. And then you'll also use 2 fingers to scroll instead of 1. So those are all the things that you'll definitely need to know. Okay, how many people have an Apple or iOS device? Okay, so I'm going to skip these screenshots since somebody's got TalkBack on. So with Apple, essentially what you want to do on iOS is go to bit.ly/NDC AAA iOS. And I can actually just scroll through these guys. So you'll start by going to Settings, and then General Settings. Once you get to General, you can go to Speech. And once you go to Speech, you can just turn on Speak Selection. So the cool thing about iOS is it's pretty easy to get to what language you'll want to hear as well. So you can just go to pronunciation and choose different languages and different voices. Okay, so I'll just leave this up here, and then I'm going to get into VoiceOver on my computer as well. So the way that you do it on a Mac device is actually you just press Command and F5.
VoiceOver on Keynote, accessing accessibility key window, show navigator button has keyboard focus. Show the slide navigator. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
So as you can see, I've chose a British voice because we really like British accents in the US. So let's see. If I go to, I'm going to get out of my slides really quickly.
Accessing accessibility key window. Chrome, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 20 window. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 20 web link. Contents. You are currently on a link inside of web content.
So you can see how I'm tabbing through and what the screen reader is reading.
Press Control Option Shift up arrow.
So let's check out NDC. Sorry, I'm kind of putting NDC on the spot by doing this.
NDC Sydney 2017 Vertical Line Software Developers Conference web content 90% loaded, 78% loaded. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control Option Shift down arrow. Visited link. NDC left brace Sydney right brace banner 1 item. You are currently on a link. To click this link,
Okay,
press Control
it's not
Option
terrible.
Space. Visited link. Get your tickets. List 3 items. You are currently
Okay,
on
there's
a
no
link. To click
there's
this
no
link,
skip
press
navigation.
Control
That's one
Option
thing that
Space.
I'll point out.
Menu button. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control Option Space.
Okay,
Press
let's
menu
see
button.
if we can get there. So we're in the menu.
Visited link.
Okay,
Tickets.
I can
List
tab
9
through.
items.
That's good.
You are currently visited link. Agenda. Visited link. Visited link. Visited link.
Let's go to information.
You are information. NDC Sydney 2017 visited link. Visited link. Menu button.
And then so you can see that having the skip navigation would be really helpful here.
Space. Visited link.
Oh, what's that?
List 9 items. You are
Uh-oh.
currently on the link. To click this link, press Control Option Space. Visited link.
Oh.
Agenda.
So that's something to note. So I'm actually in the menu right now.
Control Option. Visited link. Visited link. Link. Visited link. Link.
So even though the menu is actually closed visually, it's open for the screen reader. Ooh, where am I
You
now?
are currently on a link. 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 Partnership.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
You are currently on a link inside of web content.
All right.
This link, press Control Option.
I think that's enough voiceover. Okay. So that's just a demo of what voiceover's like and using a screen reader. I'm also just going to show you really quickly voiceover utilities. So if you have a Mac device, this is really neat because you can go to speech and then you can actually choose a bunch of different voices. So I really like bad news. So obviously, I mean, these are joke ones, but if you go to speech, you can customize it. And there's all, for example, if you speak English, there are many types of English to choose from. You have United States, you have Australia, India, Ireland, you have Scotland, you have South Africa, and the United Kingdom. And you may have noticed that I actually have Diego Compact in Spanish, and that's Argentinian Spanish because we have an engineering office down in Argentina. Okay, so that's voiceover utility. Now I'm going to go back to my slides, maybe. Sorry, technical difficulties here. Or maybe not. Okay, sure. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so to finish up, I want to talk a little bit about accessibility at Eventbrite. So the first person to get everything started in accessibility was an engineer named Ali Lacker. she really pushed for making sure that Eventbrite was accessible and trying to get everything started. So the first thing that she did was she acquired buy-in from people in the higher ups, they. So she started by creating a presentation, and she talked about the benefits of accessibility. And there are several. So the first she talked about were sales benefits. And one example is we would be able to get clients who required accessibility compliance. So for example, schools that are taking federal funding in the US. So there's a sales benefit there in the ability to get ticket fees by closing those clients. Legal benefits are something that we've talked about already. So making sure that we're actually following the law. And then also that gets tied into internationalization and making sure that things are accessible across different countries and across different laws in those countries. And then lastly, of course, actually it should be firstly really, but consumer benefits and making sure that your website is much more easily navigable by people using your website. So she made this whole presentation, and she was able to get buy-in from people higher up. And so we started actually by having WebAIM come in and do an entire audit of our consumer flows. So WebAIM is a nonprofit organization, and they operate out of the Center for Persons with Disabilities at Utah State University, and that's been since 1999. But essentially, they put out a ton of standards and guidelines on how you make your website accessible, but then they also will partner with people, and they can actually run accessibility audits on your website. So we partnered with them, and that's what we had them do. And so we got an idea of where we really need to work on things to make them accessible on Eventbrite. Ali also put together a cross-functional team. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of making sure that this is cross-functional. It doesn't only come from engineering. You'll need the support of all types of people because this affects so many people in so many different areas. So we had people in engineering, we had people from content strategy, we had an account exec who was from sales, we had design involved, we had customer support involved, we had our QA team involved, and also our legal team involved. So it's quite a bit of people just pulled together to talk about how to make our website accessible. And then from that, we were able to put together more documentation and best practices. So our centralized accessibility information is actually on Google Drive. We also have a series of videos that talk about how to make things accessible. And then we have a bunch of internal documentation, so things like having notes on GitHub and how to make things accessible for engineers. There are guidelines specifically for design and how they're going to make things accessible in their designs. There we go. So some tools that we use at Eventbrite. So the first is a color contrast analyzer, and our design team actually uses that. It's a plugin for Sketch, so they can check to make sure that their designs have the correct color contrast before they go over to engineers. We also use Totally, which is that plugin that I mentioned earlier, where you just drop that script in, and we actually have it available on our dev and QA sites. We're currently also in the process of migrating everything over to React and Redux, so we also have this linter plugin, which is pretty great, so it'll actually check your JSX. And so anytime somebody is trying to compile and push their code up, they'll get an error if it's not accessible, and so they actually have to stop and make things accessible before they can push their code. And then we have a bunch of acceptance tests that also check to make sure that things stay accessible across the site. So here you'll see the color contrast analyzer for Sketch. So you can just tell your designers like, hey, get this plugin, and then make sure things are have the correct color contrasts. Here you'll see Totally, and the way that Totally works is it's a tiny little tab in the bottom left, and it's got little spectacles. And when you click on that, it expands up, and it'll analyze your site. So it'll check things like header and header structure, color contrast, images having alt text, and things like that. We also have a bunch of acceptance tests. So here you can see a bunch of our acceptance tests, which are written in Python, and we check things such as Your links have text, so you don't have a bunch of blank links. Your images have alt attributes. Oops. And then other examples are making sure that your inputs have labels associated with them. If you put together an accessibility project at your company, I highly recommend using project management. So we actually set benchmarks, and we use a Jira dashboard to track those. We have like goals, we try to set deadlines, and then involving program managers can be super helpful as well to make sure that you're staying on track. So our initial estimate was that it would be about 2 tickets or so per team of 3 to 7 developers, and that was per sprint, which is about 2 weeks for us, and then for 10 sprints. So this is what our accessibility dashboard looks like. So we can keep track of what tickets are being worked on or in progress, which ones have been resolved. We have them organized by team, so we can see which team. Of course, my team has the most accessibility tickets that we need to take care of. And it's really helped because people can just like check out how we're doing in a quick second. Oops. This is a stock image from Keynote, but it worked really well with this slide, so definitely don't work alone. So you'll want to have people on your team being, as I said earlier, allies to work with you, and have those people be accessibility ambassadors with you. Because doing it alone, you're going to just be that like one targeted person who's like, Jen's always bothering us to be accessible. So you need people on your team to make sure that they're like helping you out there, so you're not the one targeted person. So the way I started to do that was actually, I had the privilege of going to our Argentina office. So you see here I'm hosting an accessibility workshop, and everybody has headphones on, and they were asked to turn down their screen brightness, and all they had to do was sign into their Eventbrite account and then purchase 1 ticket to any event. And we had about an hour, and nobody was able to do it. So that kind of brought things into perspective for people, for our engineers, and we have people in design and QA here as well. And they could really understand like how hard it is to navigate our website. I mean, of course, we're noobs at screen readers, so we're not going to do as well as somebody who's more experienced, but it was really hard. The other thing, like with don't work alone, is like we really need to work as a team, and this is something I said after everybody totally freaked out. And the reason why everybody totally freaked out is if you look at this button here on this little slideshow, that's a button. That's not something I photoshopped in, and it was added by one of our engineers to help pause, start, and stop this animation or slideshow. And the designers were like, "What is that?" And so they got really mad, and that just kind of points out the importance of making sure you're working with design to make sure, while this is accessible, we also want things to look nice as well. So we have a resolution on the way, so we're working with the design team to make something a little nicer looking. All right, so what happened with the Eventbrite consumer accessibility project? So it's still a work in progress. I say sorry for any inconvenience caused, because we're slowly working through our tickets and making things more accessible. In the future, the things I really want to work on is I want to make sure that we complete all of our Jira tickets. I also want to build out an accessibility process checklist, which we have in the works, and that would be for our product team, our design team, engineering team, and QA teams. And so each department would have their own checklist to make sure that the work they're doing is accessible. I also want to have a more focused effort from our front-end Foundry team, because I think accessibility touches everything across the website. It's not one feature team, and so we really need a push from our front-end Foundry team. And then I'd like us to just have more involvement with the accessibility community as well. And some resources. So as I mentioned before, there's WebAIM, there's WCAG, and then also there's this accessibility Slack channel that you can have access to. So they have a bunch of accessibility advocates that are part of the Slack channel. So if you have questions or if you have resources to contribute, it's a really good place to be. And that's all I've got for you. I think I can take some questions if anybody has any. So the question is, after having the workshop, did people forget to continue checking for accessibility, and did they retain their buy-in? So I would say that it depended on person to person. Out of that workshop, I definitely found a few people who became more accessibility advocates, which is great because it's a smaller office. And so there are a few of them that are constantly kind of like helping to make sure things are accessible. So they're just checking different pull requests out and making sure that those things are accessible. So yes, buy-in does drop off for some people, but as long as I think you really hit a core with a few people, that can be super helpful. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Have you had any feedback from disabled users?
The question is, have we had any feedback from disabled users? So we haven't had any specifically positive feedback because I think it just means your website is usable. But we definitely get information when things are not usable. And so those are tickets that we work on kind of constantly to make sure that things become more and more accessible. I would like to bring in people to actually test the website, maybe like my grandma, for example, and see how things work. And I think that would give us like much more informative feedback. Go ahead.
Are you doing work, or are you planning to do more work, both accessibility for people with intellectual or cognitive disability?
So the question is, are we doing more work for people with cognitive or intellectual disabilities? Not at the moment, but it's definitely something that's on my radar because I don't want it to fall by the wayside.
Follow-up question for that. There's a lot of tools for visual accessibility and those things. Are there tools for helping with cognitive disabilities?
Oh, I think Denny has. So Denny is actually giving a talk right after this about accessibility as well. So I think he may have an answer for you.
I'm going to say I'm doing a talk more about intellectual and cognitive disabilities. It's after this and room 7.
Yeah. So everybody, if you're still interested in accessibility and you still have buy-in, definitely check out Denny's talk. Elle Waters is also giving a talk on accessibility later today, and both Elle and I are doing an AMA at, I think, 5:40. Any other questions? Okay, you get 6.5 minutes back. Thank you.